Welcome. I'm Jill Jonathan with Red Wine and Blue, here with my co-host Joe Carducci, and we have a very special guest, Mike Hixenbaugh. If you don't know about Red Wine and Blue, you need to know about us. We're a community of women who use digital media and friend-to-friend organizing to change the world one suburb at a time. And let me tell you, we need it. We need it in the suburbs for sure. And one way that we also do this is through conversation. We like to talk about those hard things, those things that are really prevalent in our communities. And public school system, school boards is definitely something there. And Mike has two incredible podcasts, Southlake and Grapevine. If you haven't listened, you definitely need to listen to those. And now he just has a brand new book out called They Came for the Schools. So Mike, thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to talk to you.
Thank you for making time.
Yeah. So let's just start with that title, because I think
Sure.
that title kind of has two meanings, which I think we can kind of relate to here in the suburbs. So can you just tell us a little bit about why you came up with the title? Yeah.
Well, one, I knew that it would be provocative to put it out there, but really what it began with was, I tell this story, the story of America and what you all have experienced in the suburbs, through one town in North Texas called Southlake that you may have heard of from our past reporting. And it's one of these kind of, affluent suburbs where everyone is flocking here. And when I would ask them why did you move to Southlake? Why are you here? A variation of the same answer from everyone. They came for the schools. And so that's what's drawn people to these communities, this kind of pursuit of the American dream of a good education for my kids. And obviously over the last few decades, that has been drawing a very multicultural, multiracial crowd to these communities that used to be all white. But also through my reporting, I've heard from folks on the right who have claimed or argued that for the past several decades, the woke left has been secretly infiltrating school districts. I've heard Alan West, the former Texas GOP chairman who was kind of leading this fight in Southlake, at one point compared what the progressives have done in education to what Hitler did in Nazi Germany, where he was indoctrinating the kids, trying to change America through the children. The woke left came for the schools while you weren't paying attention. And now, obviously, the Christian conservative right is in the past several years working really schools to defeat what they call critical race theory or DEI or woke gender ideology, whatever the term of the moment is. They see the schools as an opportunity to advance that worldview in America.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you for writing this book. And I really do appreciate the sort of double meaning of that title. I think you lay out in the book how these Southlake incidents are not isolated, right? So this isn't just something that may be happening in one community. This is actually sort of a playbook, part of a larger agenda that is very well funded, right? And again, national in scale. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I was writing this book and we were making the podcast, the goal was really to present a story so that anyone who's living in a community anywhere in the country where you've seen angry neighbors showing up at school board meetings, complaining about CRT or library books, that through the story of one community, you would get a better understanding of why that's happening in your town. And part of the way I do that is, to go deep, not just on what sparked this conflict in Southlake and other communities, but to go way back to the beginning, to the history of what suburbs even are and why they were created and when, and the circumstances that led these communities to really develop in the aftermath of Brown v. Board, and to become these isolated places where white folks could educate their kids without having Black kids in their kids' classrooms. And so I tell that story to take it back to the beginning and trace it forward for Southlake, a history that really, you could probably copy and paste a version of this into most affluent suburbs in America, where the town set up zoning rules that kind of made it difficult for low-income housing, that in a way, without explicitly doing, kept the town wealthy, kept it white. And how through the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, people of color, parents, came looking for the same opportunities that white folks had been looking for a long time. And, into the Trump years, we were starting to see something that had been simmering under the surface in these communities for decades. This kind of what I almost think of as like the unspoken cost of admission for a Black kid to go to school in a school district like this. We were seeing coming to the public's attention through like viral videos and in other ways that, when you're a minority student in one of these great school districts in the suburbs, sometimes that comes with, an unrelenting series of insults, or what we were calling microaggressions, where kids will say to you, "Wow, you're the smartest Black kid I know," or stories in Southlake of like a kid poking a Black student's skin repeatedly and saying, "You can't feel that, you've got that thick Black skin." I think anyone who's lived in these spaces know these stories, and so coming into 2020, lots of school districts across the country were trying to, in the Trump era, we were increased awareness of America's racist past, and then of how kids were being treated in schools. And so in the book, I try to lay that out very meticulously through the first third of the book, before we even hear the phrase critical race theory, because I wanted people to understand where this all came from, to know that history, so that anyone reading the book, whether you're conservative, Trump voter, progressive, whatever, you would understand, okay, here's the facts that led us to this moment.
Yeah, and I think that's really good because, and I'll just be honest for myself as well. It wasn't until 2016 where a big shift came for me personally, where I was like, why is this happening? And then I just started to dig in a little further, and I've talked to people who are like, yeah, this isn't anything new. And so can you talk a little bit about that community in Southlake? First, if you could just talk about the incident that happened after homecoming that kind of started everything. But then there were community members that are wait, kind of surprised by what had happened. And then there's, students of color that well, let me tell you, this isn't anything new for me. These are some things that have been said to me or done to me over the years that I just, not accept it, but we're just this is just part of my being.
Yeah, they didn't know any different. Yeah, again, the Southlake story, a version of this is happening all over the country in the 2016 to 2019 timeframe. So in Southlake, it went like this. In 2018, some white high school students at a homecoming after party posted a video of themselves chanting a kind of a call and response, saying the N-word. I say, you say, and they were singing together and laughing. And then they posted that on Snapchat, it got onto Twitter, went viral. And this is a community that's used to it's an elite suburb. Everyone wants to be us. And so this was very embarrassing for them. And the district then called a meeting just to let people vent about what they just saw. And this meeting and what happened after that is really what triggered what I'll call Southlake's racial reckoning, because it was like a dam broke. These black parents and parents of Black students came forward just with 20 years of, here's how my kid experiences life in your school district, and here's how kids have treated him or her. Here's how teachers have treated him or her, and it was shocking for lots of people in the community, including white Republicans. And so the people who were leading the charge to try to do something about this were white moms who were saying, "Oh my God, I didn't know this was happening." They were so stunned, and they came alongside, and the school board formed a committee of community volunteers that reflected the diversity of Southlake, which has grown much more diverse over the decades. Still majority white, still majority conservative, but this committee worked for a couple of years to come up with a plan to try to address this culture. And the plan just happened to have been released out into the world right in the midst of the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020.
So essentially, there was a lot of, let's say, pushback, I guess you could say, against even reconciling any of that or addressing any of that.
I mean, at first, no. At first, it was, for 2 years, it seemed like, yes, the mayor, white Republican woman, was, let's do this. Council members, Republicans, let's do this. School board president, Republican, let's do this. They're all on board. It seemed like the community was very united. They put out very unified messages, and they did like special meetings to just address this. Let's have conversations. What changed is when the plan finally came out, we were in a different moment in the country that I think we all remember, or maybe try not to, in the midst of the pandemic. And the tensions, this is when I came into the story, I was seeing just really ugly tensions in my suburban Houston neighborhood that was like playing out on the neighborhood Facebook page, with warnings of Antifa coming to shoot the neighborhood up, which is crazy. We didn't even have sidewalks. Where was Antifa wasn't coming to my neighborhood. But also like the sign wars with, the Trump flags getting bigger, and the Black Lives Matter signs coming out to protest them. And it was like, wow, this is really some intense animosity in the suburbs, in this community. And that's the climate that what was called the Cultural Competence Action Plan in Southlake, that it was launched into that. Right around the same time that some progressive students in town, high school students, had done their own Black Lives Matter rally in like Southlake's ritzy town square. And it had just awakened this kind of reactionary conservative movement in Southlake of folks who were saying, this isn't my town. How is there a Black Lives Matter protest in my town? And what's this about a plan about diversity and inclusion? What is this? And so the blowback, once the plan was publicized and released, was really intense.
I mean, I think like we were talking about before, like a lot of us can relate to that, like that summer of 2020, where I think we kind of were seeing a national racial reckoning. And then a lot of us were like, okay, this is great. And then there was just like a complete pushback. And like even in my local school community, it was the same thing. And then we got extremists voted on school boards. And it was just, we had so much, I don't know, like blowback in our school community for a couple of years. And I'm happy to say that we've kind of like moved through that, like with the school community. But did you find that there were people in Southlake that really stood up for that and were like, no, we're not going to be okay with this pushback on these initiatives?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It became very divisive. And so there were people on both sides of the argument making really strong comments for, we can't stop this. In fact, this plan is more important than ever now that we've seen, a man murdered on television, basically. We want to push this forward. And the other side had a completely different perspective. This is what is a theme throughout the book, and just kind of this moment in American history is like it's not that we're debating what is the best solution to a problem. It's people are living in alternative realities of what is there a problem even. So the debate in Southlake shifted pretty quickly from, is this plan that you've laid out the best way to address racism and these reports, is to those kids are exaggerating. Those stories aren't real. This is just some, these parents are exaggerating. They have a political axe to grind. This is a pretext to force far left ideas on our kids. So there was no shared baseline of reality of, these incidents are real and they happened. And so now let's discuss. We can debate from there what the solution is. Maybe you don't want, this kind of DEI training, or maybe you think it's a bad idea to have. The school district was proposing like tracking microaggressions. A lot of people were like, like, let's make people aware of these things. But are you going to track microaggressions? So like, but that debate didn't happen. It was more foundational. It was, you people want to teach my children, my white kids, to hate themselves, to hate America, and that all Black kids are just victims and inherently oppressed, and white people are oppressors. And so it's almost like straw man version of reality that was the battle. And, that was fed by national politics. That was fed by Chris Rufo going on Fox News to introduce the world to critical race theory, and Donald Trump, who picked that up and ran with it. And so it became really toxic in the community. But Southlake was a Trump plus 30 district in 2020. And so when I say I called it bitterly divided. Well, the two sides of the struggle weren't equal in proportion. About 70% of Southlake residents backed the candidates who were opposed to the DEI plan.
Let's talk about that false pretext about, the woke ideology and the grooming and the indoctrinating and the CRT and all of that stuff, set up against what is actually happening, and reflected in your title, They Came for the Schools, which is that the Christian right is coming for our public schools. I mean, that's not hyperbolic or histrionic to say that, right? I mean, this is part of an agenda, and they're using the pretext of the far left sort of having an agenda to fuel what they're actually doing. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and it's difficult to fully pinpoint when that became the main thing for some people, because this has evolved in the last 3 years. I think there was an initial, just in Southlake, there was just an initial local, you can say, grassroots outrage that was fed by images that they were seeing on Fox News. But I don't think the parents who were protesting originally were thinking, let's stop this DEI plan and hang up the 10 Commandments instead. But what's happened in the years since, this became this idea that, Steve Bannon put it, the path to save America is through the schools. The Republican conservative movement in America really mobilized around that idea. And so what we've seen is some groups who have been fighting kind of a different struggle for decades kind of hitch their wagons onto the school culture wars. And one of those is, you hear the phrase Christian nationalist, Christian Americanist, Christian supremacist, whatever label you want to use. Folks who have argued for decades that America was in fact founded as a Christian nation, whose laws and Constitution are based on the Bible, and that it should be one again. That America, the good days were before prayer was removed from school, and we got to get back to that. And so those folks have been fighting that fight for decades, in different ways. And starting in like 2022, I really started noticing that those groups were leaning into the backlash against DEI programs, but especially the anti-transgender backlash in schools. They were seeing that as LGBT. David Barton is one guy who is kind of at the center of this. He's the most prominent Christian right activist who's propagated the myth that America was founded as a Christian nation. You could hear him talking in 2022 saying, a third of Gen Z kids or more identify as LGBTQ. That is the result of the schools taking God out of the classroom, and now we've got to go put God back in the classroom to keep these kids from being transgender. And then he literally called out, like, look at the election results in Southlake. You can tell people are motivated. This is our chance. He's talked about, and others have talked about, let's get the 10 Commandments. There's been bills all over the country. Let's hang the 10 Commandments. Let's put Christian chaplains in the schools. Let's privilege a Christian worldview over others, essentially. And some people, David Barton in particular, has advocated for, get prayer back in the class or at the school board meetings. Let's draw a lawsuit, get this thing to the Supreme Court, and then we can overturn this idea of the separation of church and state. Now that we've got this great supermajority on the Supreme Court. So the schools are a proxy for they've become just kind of like a proxy for a much bigger fight over basically what is America.
Like that's really it right there. And so I just have two questions, I guess. Like the first is, where is Southlake now in 2024? Are they pretty much the same place they were when you started following them? Has there been any progress?
It's interesting things happened. Just to go back to that Steve Bannon line, like the path to save the countries through the schools. The idea really was we're going to win back suburban white voters who were repulsed by Trump by fighting these culture wars. And Southlake was like the shining example. That's how we're going to do it. That hasn't happened. Instead, what's happened is the school, all of the most ugly parts of national politics have been just kind of superimposed onto local school board elections. But that's also animating folks like you all. And so progressives and moderate conservative parents have really gotten organized. And so in school districts where, Biden did well in 2020, they've kind of fended off Moms for Liberty. But in school districts like Southlake, where, again, it was Trump plus 30, the Southlake's Families PAC, Moms for Liberty style candidates have taken complete control. They have all 7 seats on the school board. They have eliminated the diversity plan that had come out in 2020. They rolled back and removed explicit protections in the student code of conduct and the non-discrimination student that called out protections for LGBTQ kids. They removed those. And now they're kind of set up to be, again, at the kind of the forefront of this. The Department of Education opened a series of 8 civil rights investigations into the district in the midst of all of this, after reports from students who said that they were discriminated against based on their race or gender or sexual orientation. And just last week, amazing timing, I did not plan this. Dana Lash has accused me of orchestrating this with the Department of Education and the Biden administration. I don't have that kind of sway, but just last week before the book came out, Department of Education got in touch with Carroll Schools to let them know that they were ready to negotiate on 4 of those civil rights complaints, which means that they substantiated that 4 students' civil rights were violated. This is really important because, or an important test in some ways, because Department of Education, when they find civil rights violations like these, a lot of times what they do is they come in and say, all right, well, here's what you need to put in your code of conduct. Here's what language you need in your non-discrimination statement. You should do these types of diversity and inclusion training for teachers and staff, maybe for the students as well. The exact kind of stuff that the Southlake voters have repeatedly rejected as DEI or critical race theory or whatever. And so normally when this happens, school districts just kind of negotiate because they don't want to lose their federal funding. And what we're waiting to see now is, what will the Carroll School Board do? Are they going to fight the culture war and take the fight to the Biden administration and try to fight them in court over this? And so that's where it's at right now. It hasn't. They've won at the local level, but the tension hasn't lifted.
Speaking of the Department of Education, since we currently have one, you talk a little bit about what a national education policy might look like under, God forbid, Donald Trump, who in the past putting Betsy DeVos in charge of the Department of Education, who is essentially against the Department of Education's very existence. Can you talk a little bit about what a national education policy would look like under a second Trump term?
Yeah, I've been pointing to the Southlake example is to make the point that education is on the ballot in the presidential election. Trump, his most recent position on this has been, I'm going to abolish the education department and then return anything that the federal education department was doing, which includes enforcing federal civil rights, send that back to the states. And so it's the same kind of language you hear around abortion. It's the same trend where you see like we're going to have a less unified baseline for what rights you have in America, depending on what state you live in. And so that would extend to schools, depending on what your state legislature is doing. And then I think even more important than what Trump has said, because Trump says lots of things, there's this, you may be familiar with the Project 2025. It's this blueprint that's been put together by the Heritage Foundation and dozens of other groups that are kind of, every major group that's part of the conservative movement in America has signed on to this. And it just lays out in intense detail what a second Trump term could look like. What are the priorities? Here's the, like, black and white policy proposals. And so when you go to the education section, with this, and this just hasn't gotten much attention that I've seen, it also calls for eventually abolishing the education department. But in the interim, it spells out what it would do with civil rights, and it would immediately end administrative enforcement of civil rights laws, and require that if that's going to be enforced, it'll be through the courts, through DOJ, which just means, like, for the most part, it wouldn't get in, like, the types of cases in Southlake wouldn't get enforced. It would roll back explicit protections for kids based on the basis of sexual orientation and gender, which is kind of what the Biden administration has pushed for. And they would go, and they even said that they would go back to districts that have had faced penalties for these types of violations in recent years and tell them, whatever plan you agreed to, you don't have to do it anymore. You can go back to what you were doing before. That's all kind of spelled out in that document. And so, yeah, that's a big difference. And those groups are also very big on school choice or vouchers or school privatization. They really, you've seen this everywhere, that the push is to give parents the money to send their kids to private schools, or to even pay them to homeschool.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because we see that all the time here in the work that we do at Red, White, and Blue, and we talk about that, dismantling the public education system. There's something behind that. So I'm glad you mentioned school privatization. Could you just talk just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, some people have argued that this whole thing has been a pretext. Some people on the left have argued that this whole backlash has been a pretext to tear down support for public schools and to push school choice. I think that maybe overstates it, but it's certainly part of what's happening, that there's certain folks who have seen this backlash around DEI and other issues as an opportunity to push school privatization. Groups that have, again, on the Christian right and elsewhere, that have long wanted public money for private religious schooling. I also have seen in Texas, especially in the communities I cover, a lot of folks who were showing up at school board meetings to complain about critical race theory in 2021 aren't on board with this piece. And so it's not quite this, not everyone on the right is pulling in the same direction on school choice and school privatization. I feel like I've seen a number of parents in Southlake even who are now, who voted for the board majority as it exists now, who are raising concerns about some of the push around that they've seen from like Patriot Mobile, this group that has helped support their candidates. They're raising concerns about school choice, school privatization, and some of the infusion of Christian symbols in the classrooms, because really they were upset about the race thing and also LGBTQ issues, but now they're getting off the train at this point. So it's been interesting to kind of watch that.
Yeah, they've jumped the shark almost too much to keep people who are there just for the hate part on board. But to the point about the blowback, there is a blowback to the blowback, right? So what you've seen as well, we've seen it here, Pennsylvania in particular, where there was so much response to pushing back against the extremism that they were able to flip boards all over the place, from the far right to reasonable, sane people. Can you talk about a little bit real quickly about some of that effective pushback and how we can sort of, again, feed into that, encourage more of that, have conversations like these, or whatever you think would be effective?
Yeah, I document in the book what I call the Southlake playbook that got copied and pasted in school districts all over the country by the conservative right. I think I've seen a number of groups, but especially since 2022, but especially since last year, where as progressive parents and disillusioned conservatives who aren't on board with kind of the MAGA wing of the GOP, have banded together, and they've kind of copied the Southlake playbook to a certain extent. They formed their own little political action committee that often has less resources than the ones on the right, I've noticed, and they've gotten organized and they've put together campaigns. The one I call out in the book is in Round Rock, Texas, outside Austin, which is, a purple district where there was a big push. The pack of Southlake family style pack had formed there. And really quickly, a group of progressive parents and moderate conservatives got together to put together their own. And even though they were outfunded and they didn't have, like, the conservatives had the support of the state GOP even, but the Round Rock folks held off and defeated those other candidates. And their slogan was "Make school boards boring again." and so, yeah, like I kind of call out the Round Rock strategy is kind of the answer, the left's answer to the Southlake playbook. And that's been you can see more and more of the headlines, like Moms for Liberty striking out in a lot of places. And it's the same thing as I mentioned, like if your district isn't one that was a Trump majority district in 2020, then the folks on the left and in the middle have a chance to win these school board seats.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of where I wanted to, like, follow up with this. And we see that at Red, Wine, and Blue, like across the states that we're really focused on, is that people are pushing back and they're winning and they're making school boards boring again. And I can attest to that because I used to go to all our school board meetings because they were wild. And I was like, I've got to be paying attention. And I'll be honest, I've missed a couple lately because I'm like, they're boring again. But don't get too cozy. I'm like telling myself and other people, still pay attention. But Mike, thank you so much. I mean, this is so important for everybody who's not really aware of what's going on and, their local communities with schools and school boards. And I think your book really it's so engaging, and I think a lot of people can relate to it, and it's just really well told, just like the podcast. So where can people find your book?
Oh, you can get you should be able to pick a copy up at anywhere where you buy books. If you want to go to MikeHixenbaugh.com, there's links to all the stores where you can pick it up. There's a link to bookshop.org where you can order it from indie stores. But I appreciate anyone who does pick up a copy. Let me know what you think. I'm very excited to have it out into the world, and I hope my hope is that it brings some measure of, for those people whose lives have been disrupted in a very personal way by this, I hope it gives you some measure of peace and just comfort knowing that you're not alone, and that if you're one of those people who are just kind of cluing into this and trying to understand what's happening, I hope it gives you a picture of why what's happening is happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And just want to encourage everybody to, at Red, Wine, and Blue, we're here to help you. We can help you organize. If you just go to redwine.blue, you can be connected for sure. So before we end, Joe, just want to make sure you don't have anything else.
No, thank you so much for this conversation. It's so important, like you said, to make those people who've been impacted negatively by this feel seen, but also to educate and illuminate, to shine a light on how crucially important this is, because we can't take any of this for granted. We always talk about that, Jill, right?
Yeah.
And so I appreciate you so much. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.